I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing our first speaker, Congressman Hoyer. He was elected to Congress in 1981 and is currently the House Democratic Whip and the representative from Maryland's 5th District. He is here this morning to talk about his vision for and leadership of the House Democrats' Make It in America initiative. I also want to indulge you in letting you know that I've known Congressman Hoyer for quite a few years, since I started covering the Congress when I was only 9 years old. And he is not only a distinguished, tireless legislator who has been working on behalf of American workers in both parties for many years, but he is in a very partisan and polarized atmosphere, the rare member of his party's leadership who has earned the respect and sort of reverence, really, for his love of the institution and protection of it, and the process and the dignity of the process from both sides of the aisle. And I think that's a rare treasure in today's environment. Welcome, Congressman Hoyer.
Okay, you can see why I agreed to do this.
I actually don't pass out that many compliments, so that means something. Congressman Hoyer, we go back a while, and I do remember the year of 2010, when you managed to push through the Made in America Act. And I am interested in looking back at that time, before we move forward, looking back at that process. It was in the aftermath of healthcare. It was a tumultuous period. What did you see a need for, and how did you coalesce interested parties in both parties to move forward with something in such a busy time when there was so much other legislating going on and so much fighting going on? And what groundwork did you lay for a changing industry?
Well,
6 years
first
ago.
of all, you place in context 2010. December 07, we started into the slide, into the deepest recession that anybody that's under 90, and I presume all of us are under 90 in this room, experience. Deepest recession. You have to put it in that context, and the fear and the angst that created, which is still impacting our election and our environment. Mark Mellman, a pollster for both the private sector and does a lot of political polling as well, does my polling, came in and talked to about 20 people. I was then majority leader, 20 members, and we talked about what messages resonated with the American people in terms of how America was going to be successful in the decades to come. And he talked about Made in America resonating and people believing that if America was going to be successful in the decades to come, it would be because all over the world there'd be Made in America goods. And we talked about that for about 20 minutes, and I sort of stopped and said, you know, Made in America is what we did yesterday. We ought to call our agenda Make It in America, because Make It in America obviously has at least two meanings. One, manufacturing, making things, and number two, succeeding. And that's what the context of 2010, I think, was about, and still is, as a matter of fact. I think that's what we're seeing in the 2016 election. So we constructed and started to construct this Make It in America agenda, which was one about revitalizing manufacturing, bringing jobs home, and having decision makers expand their enterprises here in America, because here in America was the best place to do it. And so in talking about the environment, we then started talking about legislative proposals that would be necessary to do that. So that's how we got started on this. I've talked to Republicans and a lot of Democrats, and the Democratic caucus essentially adopted that as one of our main themes. And frankly, my party sees ourselves as the party of workers and creating jobs. And if you're going to do that, you need to be the party of employers as well, to make sure that employers are creating jobs, expanding, investing.
And things have changed just a bit. You, I understand, are undergoing a process to sort of update this program to address today's challenges. And I'm interested in how it's evolving to adapt to a changing economy. What are the new challenges?
Well, it really is a starkly fast-changing economy. We're in a sharing economy that we talk a lot about. We're in an economy that maybe doesn't produce a cup, but produce ones and zeros. We're in a changing employment environment. Uber is a perfect example. They have 1.5 million people that work with Uber, and all are perceived to be independent contractors. A very different relationship. And that's a challenge for public policy. It's a challenge for employees, and of course a challenge for employers as well. So we just had a hearing, a series of hearings this past year and earlier this past year, in which we talked about, okay, in this new changing economy, it's still a make it in America, but make it in America may mean different things rather than just producing a cup. It may be producing apps, it may be producing software that you don't think of as manufacturing. But what do you need to do? Obviously, education was a key. Everybody that testified, whether they were manufacturers, whether they were members, whether they were people who were involved in building economies in local governments, they all talked about education, the need for a skilled workforce, not only basic education, but skills education. We talked about investment in infrastructure. We've talked about taxes and regulations. Obviously, those are big decisions when somebody's saying, I'm going to invest money to expand here in America or go overseas, and also to bring jobs back. So those are the kinds of focuses we've had. I was out at the Merchant Mart in Chicago, and one of their floors, where there were 300 businesses, no more than 2 or 3 people in each one of the businesses on one floor, all thinking about how we create new jobs, how we create new things, the Internet of Things. And so it's a new economy, but it is the same requirement that we provide jobs for people who can support themselves and their families and expand the economy here in America.
And when you talk about you need an educated and skilled workforce, where are we in the spectrum of the progress we've made and the progress we need to make? You hear about this all the time in almost every field, particularly in manufacturing and in the energy sector, that we really need to come around the curve on preparing the next wave in the workforce with certain skills that they're not getting. And how, looking back to 2010, now, 4 years from now, how are you feeling about where we are in that process?
Well, we need to focus on 2 things. For instance, you go to a manufacturing plant now, and they're, number one, extraordinarily clean. Much of it's robotics and computerization.
Right.
So you need different skills. And frankly, if you have robotics and computers running your manufacturing, you need some people. Obviously, somebody's got to program the computer, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, maybe one person could do the job of 5 or 10, which means you need 10 additional enterprises. Now, there are markets all over the world, so what we have to do is not just lament the fact that we have fewer jobs in a particular manufacturing facility, we have to make sure there are more manufacturing facilities so that we can provide jobs. But in order for them to do the jobs, they have to have the training both in primary and secondary education, in apprenticeship programs, in skill programs at junior colleges, which are partnered with advanced manufacturing elements, so they know how to train people. Give you a specific example. We're not doing it now because natural gas has made it uneconomic, but I have a nuclear power plant in my district. So we got a grant for the community college that is located in the same county, on Calvert County on the Chesapeake Bay, to train people that if in fact we went forward with building a new reactor, that we'd have the skill sets in our county in order to provide the jobs or people for the jobs that would be available. Now, that didn't go forward, but that's the concept of making sure that we have a partnership between the manufacturing sector, between the educational sector, and between work investment boards whose job it is to match those up.
And what's the role of government in fostering those connections, those relationships, those requirements? I mean, you're asking the private sector to help academic institutions train future workers. Where is the connection between the three, government and academics and industry? You can rely on many companies, obviously, are doing this on their own, and it's what they want to do. But to meet what is obviously a burgeoning need, what's the role of government in that process?
Well, I think government and business have to be in partnership. And one of the roles is for the government, when you have public schools, when you have community colleges, when you have four-year institutions, is to understand the workplace. And the best way to understand the workplace is to talk to people who are hiring people who have a need for skill sets, to give you information as to what they need. Now, obviously, you're right. Businesses themselves have a economic interest in training their people. But in training their people, they need people who have basic skills to come to math and reading and all the sorts of basic skills, then on the particular skills. But there are other things that we need to do in terms of manufacturing and the government informing people. For instance, there's a real need for welders in America. You make things, you put things together. A welder can make six-figure incomes, a senior welder. I was at a community college in southwest Illinois, run by former Congressman Jerry Costello's wife. She's the president. And there was a young woman there who had been a waitress. And she'd heard that they had a welding program at the community college. She was making about $22,000 a year. She heard about this. She was in her mid-20s. She decided to do this. This was 10 years before I was out of the college. She is now making close to $50,000 a year as a welder, and she's in her early 30s. The conveying knowledge as to what is available and what's needed is something that government can do and something that manufacturers and business can do. But that's sort of an old traditional skill. We need to make sure that young people understand the new skills that are available to succeed in the new economy, the sharing economy.
And in terms of this long-standing tension between business wanting government to get out of its operations, just decrease regulation and reform the tax code and this type of thing and leave them alone. Where in manufacturing broadly do you find private industry and the government working most effectively and most cooperatively?
You know, there's a basic premise that the president's articulated and business communities articulated, Republicans have articulated, and Democrats have articulated. Now, you've got smart work up here. I just sort of facetiously said, I represent an institution that's right now dumb work or no work. And you know, that does not come as a news flash to any of you, I understand. But we can have some basic understanding when the President of the United States says a number of years ago in his State of the Union, we need to lower the corporate tax. And Republicans say we need to lower the corporate tax. And we say you need to lower the corporate tax. It's a shame that we haven't lowered the corporate tax. Why? Because we're not competitive. We have the highest notional rate. Not everybody pays the high rate, but the notional rate in the world. And if you do that, you're not going to be competitive. So we need to adjust that. The President said that. We have an agreement. Paul Ryan was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. David Camp before him was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, both Republicans. Camp reported out a bill. Yes. It was dismissed by his own party. It was a tough bill. I didn't agree with everything in it, but he made the tough decisions. We've got to come to a point where we do rational things that we all know need to be done to make sure that we're competitive. And on regulations, we need to make sure that regulations are in place that provide safety for the consumer, safety for the environment, and a fair, level playing field for all the competitors. Free market works best when everybody plays by the rules. But you don't want regulations to impede competition or growth. And it's sometimes tough to make that distinction.
And as tailoring regulations to a changing economy and a changing manufacturing sector been a part of Make It in America and part of your updating of it?
Yes.
What have you found? You know, you mentioned Uber. I mean, as things change quickly, what in the regulatory landscape has had to adjust for that?
Well, let me give you two examples in the regulatory that I think is frustrating for me and I think frustrating for most. We passed two major pieces of legislation that have wide spread impact on the economy. One's the Affordable Care Act, the health care, which is 19% of our economy that is affected. And the other was Dodd-Frank.
Right.
Two big, complicated bills. Unfortunately, for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been in the context of you either repeal those two or you don't touch those two. Now, that's not a rational way to proceed. We know when any of us do something, you do something at home, and then you find out, well, it didn't really work the way I was doing it here. I'm going to tweak it a little bit. We need to get to a point where on a bipartisan basis, rather than simply say we're going to repeal the Affordable Care Act, we look at it and say, okay, we adopted this bill. What is working? What's not working? What can we affect to make it work better? My Republican friends knew that Obama was not going to sign or repeal the Affordable Care Act and knew that we could override, I mean, we could sustain his veto. So we've wasted a lot of time in that. In Dodd-Frank, our concern is you have so many Republicans say repeal Dodd-Frank. Frankly, we think Dodd-Frank responded to a very significant need, and that was the financial community acting within rules which did not put at risk millions and millions of people who invested money or had IRAs, or which obviously were very badly hurt during the financial meltdown. But to think it was a perfect bill when we adopted it is not rational.
So looking a little bit at next year and the political environment, we've seen a lot of sort of anxiety about globalization this year, a lot of anti-trade sentiment. You mentioned the corporate tax. You know, it's high enough that we're not on a level playing field. We're not encouraging. The reaction seems to be that we're moving a little bit towards more protectionism than people were even ready to imagine. So if you can look at, really no matter who wins, do you believe there will be more of a focus on this next year? How the trade deals have impacted not only obviously they impacted the workforce a while ago. We're hearing from these people now, and they're very strong feelings. You know, function in a semi-functioning Congress next year. What do you imagine in terms of an agenda? Do you see a lowering of the corporate tax? Do you see addressing these issues? What do you think will happen to the debate about trade going forward?
Well, first of all, on trade, it is obviously, when you see the polls, that the majority of the American people believe trade has not been good for them and their families.
Right.
They believe we're losing jobs. Trade and globalization have happened somewhat on a parallel track. There isn't any doubt that globalization has put a real challenge to average working people in America, somewhat like when you had in New England shoe manufacturers and textile manufacturers moved south. And then 50 years later, they moved to the Caribbean, and they moved to China or Taiwan or someplace, Vietnam. So we now see that trade is looked at as undermining our ability to create and keep jobs here in America. Until we can convince the public and the Congress that that's not the case, I think it's going to be very difficult to get trade bills done. Trump says, of course, he's going to make a good deal. I think that the trade psyche is not going to change in the short term.
Right.
My hope is that when we get through this election, I'm for Hillary Clinton. I hope Hillary Clinton is elected. But when we get through this election, we stop this psychology of we're going to wait to act for the next election.
Yeah.
There's always a next election. I tell my members, you cannot solve America's problems in 24-month cycles. You have to think longer term. Hopefully, we can come together after this election, which is going to be a really seminal election. And I can't predict if frankly, Trump or Cruz win. I couldn't possibly predict what will happen. I think think it will be a very disruptive, depending upon, Cruz basically wants government out of things, and Trump basically, well, you tell me what Trump basically.
Well, on trade, interesting that Hillary's been pushed a little bit off of it, and there's a real concern that with Cruz's coming around to criticizing trade, Trump really hammering trade, you'll see a movement away and a new discussion about that. And defenders of some kind of trade will really be in sort of uncharted waters here to try to describe what we can do to make trade work.
AB, even though opponents of trade bills are not opponents of trade, they understand that in a global economy you're going to have trade. What Trump's position is, and what other positions, my friends in labor, is that good trade deals that protect American workers, trade deals that are in effect, from what Trump says, good deals,
right,
are appropriate. Therefore, I don't think anybody is saying trade is not something that we ought to participate in, that we're going to have a protectionist and close off the borders. That's not going to happen. So the issue is, what is a good trade deal? What does help America expand its own workforce? And
what will you ask of Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or Ted Cruz or anybody else in terms of a focus on manufacturing next year? What are your goals? You've been updating and upgrading your plans and your agenda, and what will you ask the next Congress? And the
well,
next
I think we need to
president?
continue. The administration's had a focus. We have manufacturing centers of excellence, Penny Pritzker, and I would call it Penny and Stenny's Make It in America plan. There has been a great focus. And we adopted a bill from Congressman Lipinski in Chicago, which said, look, we need a plan. We need a plan for what is necessary to create the environment to expand manufacturing. So I'm hopeful that we can come together, Republicans and Democrats, because Make It in America is a great agenda in the sense that it's not a partisan agenda. It's not a philosophic agenda. It's a pragmatic agenda that both Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, all say we want to create jobs and have a growing economy. Well, Make It in America is about that. It's not an ideological dividing agenda. It's a cooperative agenda.
Well, they better get to work on that first thing.
Yes.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Congressman Hoyer.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you all.